Good morning. I think that this is, I don't know how to call it, coming down with a thump from the more academic topics. It's a rude awakening or any other likewise expression, because we're going to deal with our neck of the woods, with the issue of Iran, the Middle East. And I think that we have many interesting speakers, because we are going to cover not only the issue of Iran, the regional issue, and the more general but very relevant issue for this region is the nuclear weapons, or the WMD free zone in the Middle East, which is, we heard about it something, but we are going to return to it. Our first speaker is Emily Landau. I was wondering whether I have to introduce you, Emily, because I think that everyone knows you, and many from old, some from new. But Emily is, of course, the head of the program of the Arms Control and Regional Security in the INSS. She is a senior research associate here, and she has published and lectured extensively on nuclear proliferation, arms control, and regional security in the Middle East, proliferation challenges in the post-Cold War era, Israel's nuclear image and policy, and developments in global arms control thinking in the nuclear realm. Much more can be said about Emily, but I think that I will welcome you, and thank you.
Thank you, Ephraim. Well, I was the one responsible for this topic being on the program. I insisted that we need to talk about compellence in negotiation. I wasn't the first choice for the speaker, but when our first choice couldn't do it, I immediately jumped in and said, that's my topic. So, compellence in negotiations with Iran. Getting Iran to back away from its military nuclear activities and ambitions is fundamentally a game of compellence. It's not about confidence building. It's not about moving towards the realization of a shared goal step by step, because there is no shared goal here as far as Iran's nuclear program is concerned. And the only question really is whether Iran will be convinced that cooperating with the international community is better than the alternative. Remember the setup for this negotiation. It's a very specific setup. Iran joined the NPT of its own free will in the 1970s. By the way, the new regime does not, it views itself as continuing that commitment that was made in the 1970s, not by the current regime. It's been violating that commitment and working on a military nuclear program, or working on military aspects of its program for years. And the goal of the international community is to get Iran to change its behavior, to stop the violations, and to return to the fold of the NPT. But Iran has no need or any desire for this negotiation. It actually would like to continue to maintain its military program, to maintain its breakout capability. It's already reached a virtual breakout, we can say. Moreover, the compellence game is taking place in the framework of negotiations because diplomacy became the strategy of choice for dealing with determined proliferators by the international community after the 2003 Iraq War. Obviously, diplomacy is always the strategy of choice for the Europeans, but this was not the case for the United States. But after the Iraq War was so discredited, this became the strategy of choice for dealing with proliferators. So negotiations were not an inevitable tool for compelling Iran. Negotiations were a choice. But it became apparent very quickly that there were absolutely no guidelines for conducting these very, very difficult negotiations, not even for determining who the international negotiators would be. And we see the striking differences between the Iranian context and the North Korean context. It's not the same set of actors. For Iran, we have the P5+1, Y+1, because Germany was involved in the EU3. North Korea, we have the six-party talks that we just heard about. 3 of the members are the same members, but there are 2, Japan and South Korea, that were added because the conceptual thinking behind negotiations with North Korea is totally different from the case of Iran. It's a regional approach. North Korea wanted to deal bilaterally with the United States. The United States refused to deal bilaterally with North Korea, insisted on a regional context in order to increase, or it hoped that it would increase. This hadn't worked out so well for the United States, but it hoped to increase its leverage in a regional dialogue. In order to try to compel Iran to accept the terms of the international negotiators, 2 strategies can and have been employed, so far with very limited success. The 2 strategies will not surprise you. They are inducements and pressure. Inducements are the famous carrots, and these were used primarily in the 2003-2005 period by the Europeans. And the pressure, of course, is the famous sticks that have found expression in the UN Security Council resolutions, and of course in the unilateral sanctions, primarily by the United States and the Europeans since 2010. Negotiating more effectively with Iran means understanding the ground rules and playing according to these rules. Basically, compelling Iran to comply, which is necessarily a game of hardball. And we see this playing out in the negotiations. So the challenge for the international negotiators is to arrive at a solution based on a changed Iranian attitude that inducements and pressure are expected to cause. No easy task, especially because Iran has been anything but a passive player vis-a-vis these strategies. And in fact, Iran has been devoting a lot of energy to pushing back. Iran understands that the international community is trying to use negotiations to force its will. And Iran has been trying to neutralize the ability of the international negotiators to effectively employ their strategies of compellence. So how has this played out? Well, with regard to the inducements, Iran's job has not actually been that difficult. It simply rejects them. And this is what we saw very clearly in the 2003-2005 period. Basically, Iran said no to all the goodies that were offered. And this kind of baffled the Europeans, or took them sort of off guard. They were leading negotiations in that phase, and they were somewhat surprised that their forthcoming and good faith approach was not gaining them more traction. And their conclusion actually was that the carrots were simply not sweet enough. And that's because the United States was refusing to put security guarantees on the table as well. But this was after the EU3 insisted that they would lead these negotiations and the U.S. would take a back seat, which the U.S. did quite happily, actually. But then they actually wanted the U.S. to be part of it, but according to their rules. But there's good reason to believe that by late 2004, 2005, these security guarantees would also not have gotten Iran to back down. Iran was simply not interested in this mode of compellence. With regard to the different forms of pressure, Iran, of course, has had to work harder to neutralize their effects. Regarding military force, when the EU3 took the lead in the negotiations and Iran realized that negotiations were the strategy of choice and that they would not likely be next in line for attack after Iraq, which was their biggest fear in, I would say, April, May June of 2003, Iran began working to empty the military threat of its remaining credibility. What did it do? First of all, fortified its installations. That's quite clear. But Iran also issued its own deterrent threats. What it would do in the case of being attacked. In the case of a strike, it would strike back, obviously. It would do this, that, and the other. And the latter proved quite effective. And this became apparent when U.S. officials began describing the possibility of military force as a disaster. Why were they calling it a disaster? Because obviously Iran would retaliate, and this would escalate out of control, and the Middle East would go up, in flames. And this undercut the attempt by the Obama administration to credibly maintain that all options are on the table. Because if high-level officials, and we're talking also about the chief of the the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, if these high-level officials are saying that the United States cannot afford another war in the Middle East, how credible really are all the other statements about all options? Regarding sanctions, Iran was also trying to impress upon the international community that these are illegal. Iran says, and it continues to say till today, by the way, that it has done no wrong. Therefore, any sanctions that are taken against it are illegal. That's clear. And this succeeded to a degree, I would say, as far as the UN Security Council resolutions on sanctions. Russia and China, for a long time, insisted that Iran cannot be punished too harshly because there's no clear evidence of a military program which would constitute a violation of the NPT. And I learned from our guest, Alexei, that in fact this appears to remain Russia's position till today, although it's hard to believe. In late 2011, many pundits that were writing in the media were warning against going for too harsh sanctions against Iran, because Iran may decide to lash out. Iran might exit the NPT. Iran might even move to nuclear weapons, because this is what some of these things Iran was explicitly threatening, some it was implicitly threatening. Of course, moving to nuclear weapons was not an explicit threat because Iran denies that it was ever doing that. Oddly enough, it seems that Israel's stepped up military threats at that time were the one thing that did succeed in deterring, only it deterred the Europeans, not Iran. The Europeans came to the conclusion that harsh sanctions would be better than Israeli military intervention, and thus the oil embargo, okay, which was a very good thing, yes. And by 2012, even Obama was fed up enough with Iran's non-cooperation that he, albeit somewhat reluctantly, went along with biting U.S. financial sanctions. And it was the combination of U.S. and EU sanctions in the main, there were some other countries that joined, in 2012 that finally brought Iran back to the table in 2013 in the most serious manner that we had yet seen. But it was not to end its nuclear program, but rather to get the biting sanctions off its back. And Iran by this time had identified U.S. weak spots and vulnerabilities as far as the extent of the ability of the United States to compel Iran to reverse course in the nuclear realm. First of all, the United States is war-weary. I mentioned this, and this is very clear. The United States is resisting very clear and strong threats of military force because the United States does not want to find itself at the point where it will actually have to employ military force. And the United States is left with a difficult task, and we should not, view this lightly. It's a very difficult task of compelling Iran through negotiations with only the specter of possible further sanctions as leverage. And this combination has led the United States lately, with regard to this latest negotiation dynamic that began in October 2013, to project an eagerness for a deal that unfortunately weakens its hand at the negotiations table. Because remember, this is a negotiation that's actually about compellence, a very difficult negotiation to carry through to success. The expressions of this are, first, avoiding anything that might be construed as upsetting the Iranians. I think the most blatant instance of this was the administration's very open and direct challenge to Congress on the sanctions legislation. But the United States has also been avoiding pushing back against Iran's very harsh rhetoric that we've been hearing over the past months. And it has remained harsh. Regarding the interim deal, Iran has said we can reverse that in 24 hours, you know, it's not a big deal, we can still continue, et cetera, et cetera. Its intention to continue with its nuclear program, its unwillingness to concede anything. If you listen to the Iranians over the past months, what you hear most often is no. No, no, no. We will not dismantle. We will not end our program. We will not talk about missiles. We will not talk about PMDs. We will not do this. We will not do that. Very little yes there. And of course, there have been some direct insults to the United States and to Israel by the Supreme Leader. A second expression of the eagerness to reach a deal is that the P5+1 today are conducting negotiations not on Iran reversing course in the nuclear realm, which was for a long time the stated goal. Iran needed to reverse course and, you know, leave those military ambitions. Today they're negotiating over the time that will remain between Iran and, you know, a breakout to nuclear weapons. That's a watered down goal. Okay? A third expression is the fact that we hear, you know, noises lately that the Americans and the P5+1 are not necessarily going to compel Iran to even admit that it had been working for decades on a military nuclear program. And that admission by Iran is something that could create a starting point for possibly more effective compellence regarding the necessary Iranian strategic U-turn in the nuclear realm. Because it's very difficult to demand that Iran make a U-turn when Iran is saying there's no U-turn to make because we have never been working on a military nuclear program. Therefore, this whole issue of what's known as the PMD, the possible military dimensions, Ephraim insists that we relate to actual development of the warhead and not necessarily the PMD. Bruno has just published, I think, a very important op-ed together with David Albright on the issue of the PMD. If this is not part of a comprehensive deal, there's something problematic here. What we're hearing lately from the Americans is, you know, let's not force the Iranians into an admission of guilt. Let's not put them in the confession box where they have to say, you know, oh, we did these terrible things. Let's just get a good deal from now and into the future and leave the past in the past. This is a very dangerous proposition as far as the negotiations are concerned and the prospects of getting a good deal. It needs to be based on the fact that Iran is guilty of wrongdoing, because there's no other way to get Iran to back away. And by the way, the interim deal is all about voluntary measures that each side will do. Why does it say in the interim deal voluntary measures? Because the Iranians insisted on that wording. Why voluntary? Because the Iranians say we've done no wrong. If we agree to these things that you're, you know, forcing us to agree to in the interim deal, it's because we voluntarily agreed to do this. We don't have to, because we have done no wrong. So you see the kind of problems that arise when the negotiators don't even have the same starting point, which is the clear violation of the NPT and Iran for decades working on a military nuclear program, which we know is the case. Finally, there's a sense that in this negotiation, The United States is starting to be more focused on what might be acceptable to Iran and then adjusting its positions accordingly rather than in setting its own bottom lines. I'm avoiding using the word red lines because it's just been, it's become a word with so many connotations that, anyway, the bottom lines. Obama has said very clearly that no deal is better than a bad deal. But what constitutes a bad deal? What are the critical issues that must be addressed in a comprehensive deal? And if they're not addressed in the comprehensive deal, then it will be a bad deal. It will be deemed a bad deal, and it will be rejected. This is critically important for the P5+1 to define for themselves, and then to communicate this to the Iranians. Iran needs to understand that there are real bottom lines as part of the negotiation dynamic, because I remind you, this is a negotiation that is actually a game of compellence. Otherwise, the P5+1 can basically concede on anything and then tell us that it's just the best that they could do. So for itself and for Iran, those bottom lines must be defined and they must be very clear. The final question is, and this is looking more to the future, I hope to a future that we will not see, but the final question is what the implications are for how well the United States and the P5+1 more generally are succeeding in the game of compellence as far as the ability to deter Iran down the road if it were to become a nuclear state, which, as I said, I hope does not come about. And this is a good segue to Avner's presentation. Thank you.